Hey, peace. Welcome to another episode of We Charge Colonialism podcast and book club. Before we even get started, y'all already know, like, share. We want as many people as possible to join us for this hour as we bring news and political education. I'm Akimba, a member of the Public Relations Committee.
Peace, everyone. This is Tierney Sheree. I am the steering committee chair for We Charge Colonialism.
Peace, everyone. This is Frank, member of Revolutionary Repatriation back to Africa.
All right, so we are your team, and like I said, we're going to give you an hour of news and political education. We are continuing to read from How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney, and we're going to be starting from chapter 4 today. So there should be a link for everyone. You should have access to a link that can take you to that reading. So we'll get to that in the second half of our podcast. But as usual, we always start with news around the world. And Frank, you're going to bring us some news. Get us started.
Yeah. Today's news is about South Africa. The last, I don't know. Okay, I will try to differentiate it. The last, white president. I don't want to say the last white South African president, as the media tried to put it. Because when he was the president at that time, South Africa was fighting for independence. So you can't say the last white South African president and then while South African were fighting for president. So he was, I can say, the last apartheid regime president in South Africa, because he was not a president for the South African. He was not a president for African people. So he was a president for white people in South Africa who migrated from Europe and went to Africa. So he was the president for them while Africans were fighting for independence and while Africans were fighting against the apartheid regime. So what's going on, or what have been going on in South Africa, because they wanted to honor this killer, this murderer, with to have a state, to give him a state burial. But the EFF, being a citizen of Africa or South Africa, refused to give him the honor of state burial. So that was what been going on, and they also went into the house. There was debating on anything that this guy is not going to get a state burial. We cannot do that for the kind of atrocity this guy committed during the apartheid regime. So how are we going to sit down there and give him a state burial? What is a message to those that he killed and things? So we are not going to do it. So that is why been going on and thing. But Western media try to give the narrative as if to say he was a good leader, saying that he is the last white South African president, instead of them saying he is he was the last apartheid president regime, the apartheid regime president. But they try to make it look good, and that is why it is on to us to change the narrative as they bring the story. We have to tell them, no. That is not how it's supposed to be. And in fact, this guy did not admit to the fact that, he served a brutal regime. And then he said apartheid was not, a crime committed against humanity. And he did not accept it. He only accepted it when he was in his dying bed, when he was already old and dying. That's the time he said, apartheid was a brutal regime against humanity and stuff. But other than that, he did not owe anything to it to apologize. He did not apologize at all. So such a man cannot get a state honor in Africa. In the first place, if they want to give him honor, they should take him back to Europe, where he came from. He's an alien.
Oh man, you started off right, Frank. Yeah, man. I appreciate you bringing this news. And again, this is why it's important that we have our own media and we tell these stories, because the narrative they putting out last, president of South Africa, you put it correct though. You corrected that. He was the president of the apartheid regime, a settler colonial state. You know, that's what he was residing over. And when we talk about colonialism, you know, this imperial state where they control the majority of African people who are the indigenous people of that land, you know, this is someone that cannot be looked at and honored no matter what he did to try to rectify all of the atrocities that the apartheid regime committed. You know, I was looking at the story and they was talking about how he moved up the ranks in the apartheid regime. So what was he doing so well that he was moving up the ranks? But yeah, Tim, I don't know if you had something.
Yeah, for the things that you all have already outlined, it's ridiculous. I think particularly when you think about apartheid, this is not a system where Africans were given even like a right of voting whenever there was one of these people who were going to be appointed over them. So when you think about that basic thought, this is someone who was not even like approved by the masses of South Africans. This person was specifically approved by the whites, the white class inside of South Africa. So the idea of Africans today looking backwards at this person that, by all accounts, was a part of a regime that was built on their oppression and wasn't even voted in by them. And they're supposed to give this person a state burial today. It would be asinine. So it was very correct, I think, the position that Julius Malema takes about Deklurks. And he's taken other positions about Deklurks. I don't know if you all remember, Deklurks was supposed to come into the South African parliament and the EFF was not having it. They were disrupting, you know, him trying to be present inside of there. They asked for him to be removed, and it was rightfully so. Apartheid is a crime against humanity, and the white apologists who are trying to make it seem like, you know, basically any white person who oversees some type of transition and racial progress, but really we know it's not progress. We know that it's like a racial facade, this idea that they're going to find a way to evolve the system so that it's more public, it receives more public approval, although it still accomplishes the same ends. But instead they paint this picture of Deklurks being this guy who was a pioneer of racial reckoning, who wanted to bring everyone together, but that's not what it was. And so it's for us to define our own enemies. It's for us to define our own leaders. It's for us to define what was not in our interest and what is in our interest. The media, however, is consistently going to try to push this idea that there are good people who although they participated in the system, at least they oversaw the system changing. No, you didn't oversee the system changing because you've seen that there was something wrong happening to Africans. You oversaw the system because you saw you were losing your grip on power. Anyone who knows the history of how apartheid fell, it did not fall willingly. It was literally the entire globe was turning on South Africa, and you know, for political reasons, because you see these images of African children being slain by these white racist cops. You see images of activists. You see people like Steve Biko, who was assassinated, and it's hard for the world to even the most barbaric people to even co-sign a type of regime like that. It was really until South Africa was on its last leg, the United States being one of the last ones, you know, Israel, countries like this being the last ones who were still supporting South Africa. And when the United States basically pulled out, that's when you've seen, okay, South Africa said we have to do something. So this idea that Deklurks was doing this willingly because he loved, you know, everyone, or because he was trying to do the right thing, that's a false narrative. And it's for us to define our own narratives. That's the main thing that we have to take away from this. It's not for the mainstream media to tell us what this person was, who this person meant to us. Ask the people who were alive back then what he meant to them. Ask the people whose loved ones died from police brutality or state brutality. Ask the ones who never received their land back, who still have their land occupied by these wet settler colonists. Ask them what Deklurks meant to them. And those are the only terms that we should recognize, not any of these people who tried to paint these leaders as being false equivalents of saviors of African people.
Indeed, and in a struggle, you know, right now, or a fight for African people to be liberated all over the world from these colonial powers. Like, none of these people should be acknowledged. Like, none of these colonialist settlers should be acknowledged in a way where they're honored. So, Frank, any last words before we transition? Great story.
I did see a good question in the chat. Just throwing it out there.
What was that? You said it was a question?
I seen a good question in the chat. Jamal said, "Did the panel believe Nelson Mandela sold out?" You're trying to take us on a whole topic.
Yeah, I try to stay away from all of the Uncle Toms and sellouts and all of that. Maybe Frank, maybe you like straightforward.
I can touch on it. You see, like Judah Malema once said, for every revolution, period, there's a way, you tackle it. So for one fight, you gotta get this. Nelson Mandela, I can say what he did at that time, at that point of time, right? It was the right thing. But maybe this present, like this current time, I'm gonna say like, it's not a right, it was not a right thing. But at that time, imagine, in South Africa at that time, South African, like, we never had weapon. Think about that, and we could not, resist to say we are going to take primitive weapon to go and fight, the apartheid regime at that time. You can tell that they have all the modern, sophisticated weapon at that time. So there was nothing actually Nelson Mandela could do. So all he needed to do was, you got to play the devil advocate. You got to play the game. Either you bring it on board to empower your people. So that was the only thing at that time, I believe, in my mind, Nelson Mandela could do, to either he bringing the people on board to empower his people. Because at that time, his people were not empowered to say, you know what, we're going to fight, these white folks, and then go back to where they came from. And, if he was going to take that approach, I can tell you, they was going to go right back to square, to cause 90 or to 0. So the only thing he could do, he never had a weapon and stuff. He had a manpower, but he never had a sophisticated weapon. So you can't do nothing to go against these people. You got to bring it on board to empower your people to go after them. And that is why this current time, we are being empowered to go after them.
Can I just
not
say,
the wrong way, but to go after them the right way.
I think, and yes, it's a difficult circumstance. I think that I agree with our brother Shakara. He said Mama Winnie Mandela set a better example, because I think that as African people, we have to contend that nothing is won with negotiating your freedom with your oppressor. That's my opinion. I think that you can have more favorable conditions to where the people aren't openly being victimized the same way, because apartheid, the way that the state was able to victimize the people was very different. But the outcomes, to me, that's what we have to be concerned with, particularly with power. Like, do we have more power as African people in South Africa today than we had under apartheid? And consistently, our brothers and sisters from South Africa are saying no. They're consistently saying, no, we don't have control over our own economics. We're put inside of these townships. We're literally living inside of these segregated states. And so I think that we have to really just understand, like, this is not one with negotiation. And I think, as Sakara said, Mama Winnie Mandela, she was willing to go at it with armed struggle. And in my opinion, any struggle against your oppressor that's not one with armed struggle is not going to be sufficient when you're talking about true liberation.
And just to come on that, to add on that quickly, even in the United States here, you can see for each time, Black people or African people try to take weapon just like their white counterpart. What happened? FBI come for them, the government come for them. The recent one, like the how they call it, J Master, and things, what it did, like he was recruiting Black people and arming Black people, and they saw it. I know if we can't stop these people, they're going to rise up, they're going to recruit more members. And what it did, they came after him and they're talking up, and now we can't even hear about him. But yet and say you see white people, with gun machines, marching around, and you don't see FBI going after them and things. These are just the case. Some example.
Yeah. I would just say, like I said, I don't like using, terms like sellout and Uncle Tom, but I would say he made a deal with the devil, though. That's how I look at it. There were other options, maybe that time in prison, broke his spirit, and he had no more fight in him. I don't know, but I think there could have been another direction to go, especially with all that Africans had went through under apartheid and under white rule. And it reminds me of Russell Maroon Schultz. He wrote a book. I think it's called The Implacable. But in the book, he talks about Maroons, treaty Maroons, and he described the other type of Maroons who weren't treaty Maroons. And like those treaty Maroons were the ones who would make the deal with white folks. And, if Africans who escaped slavery were caught by these treaty Maroons, they would give them back to the town. That was the agreement that was made upon them. And then you had those Maroons who were like, nah, like we fighting to the death. We trying to get rid of y'all altogether. And so, there's a difference. But moving on to the next story. I'm gonna start. Terry, you want to go? You want me to go into?
Well, speaking of South Africa, and I actually didn't realize we're both talking about South Africa, Frank. But Miss Hattie, our wonderful producer, shared a story that I'm going to actually share my screen if I can pull it up. So everyone can see this. Okay. So yes, if you don't know, obviously South Africa, the country, now we know, as we kind of laid out, the country is far from being decolonized. It's still a different type of colonialism. But enough Africans inside of South Africa who were affected and victimized by apartheid have taken strong positions against any type of uniting with Israel. And that is one thing that I would say to their credit, because they recognize, first of all, Israel was outwardly in support of the apartheid regime inside of South Africa. Israel, Shakara mentioned in the chat, he said UK was one of them, and the United States, basically like the big like white supremacist countries that are still white supremacists outwardly. We know all of them like kind of collaborate together, but the ones that aren't ashamed of it were all in support. So Israel, although they try to paint themselves a lot of times as being a people who should be looked at as being similarly situated to Africans inside of the continent, they've used these types of narratives. In reality, why is it that you have consistently stood on the side of white oppressors, whether it's South Africa, whether it's different types of revolutions inside of Africa, that whether it's the African communities in America, you see a trend. Now, because of this, South Africa does not really rock with Israel, even whenever Israel gained observer status inside of the African Union recently, which was ridiculous. South Africa was one of the ones like, nah, this is not cool. Now, I don't think they got them out, but they made very clear like they were willing to go all out to basically not allow this to happen. So the Miss Universe pageant, it says the South African government has said it's distancing itself from a decision by Miss South Africa pageant's organizers to participate in the annual Miss Universe contest due to be held next month in Israel. I thought this was very relevant because let's not forget, I know how we're like in social media time, we kind of forget like things that happened recently, but it was very recent that Israel was receiving all this public scrutiny because of their atrocities against the Palestinians. And I think like never before, you've seen people outwardly criticizing the Israeli government. How coincidental that now they want to have Miss Universe inside of Israel this same year after they just undergone this horrible PR chaos that basically turned a lot of people against Israel apartheid or made them willing to look back and actually question whether it is what they've marketed themselves to be, because they market themselves as if they're the ones that are being oppressed and the Palestinians are the ones trying to be terrorists to them. So that's how they try to argue. So I thought it was a very interesting thing that they're trying to have it this year. And also, I wanted to mention that the government has withdrawn its support from the organizers, and they're basically calling on Miss South Africa, do not participate. I've not seen whether or not she decided to participate or not, but I thought it was a very strong statement by the South African government. Not only are we not going to allow you to go inside of the African Union, or not only are we going to protest that, but any association of the South Africa with Israel, whether it's our people who organize our pageants or whatever, we're going to outwardly criticize. So I wish that more African countries knew about Israel and Africa, because, particularly because Israel right now, they're receiving so much support from different African leaders that are receiving handouts behind the scenes. But we have to go back and search that history, the present reality and the past reality of how many times they were collaborating with the CIA, they were collaborating with the surveillance, they were collaborating anytime basically when they wanted to thwart any type of African revolution.
Yeah, I was trying to look real quick because I think that the Miss South Africa, she pulled out, if I was reading it correctly, but I'm gonna take a look at it in a second. But yeah, and rightfully so. She said something about like not, the people. She was losing support, from the people, so it was in her best interest. But I think like this was a good move, and I'm with you. I think other, African countries need to step up. I'm glad that South Africa. There's some contradictions in South Africa, but I, the government, made a great decision, and I mean that's what we do. Politics is, especially like under this, we're at war right now, so there is going to be a lot of contradictions, but there's things that we just have to make sure that we don't compromise, especially when dealing with, Israel, who is another settler colonial state. We have to call it like it is. And who gets a lot of support from the West. And so there has to be, you have to pick a side in this.
Yeah.
And I think that was a great example that South Africa shows, but we, have to just keep going a step further, because even when we talk about Israel, Israel is the state, but, we have to look at the people who are citizens of that state and what they're doing around the world, and people who attach themselves to Israel, whether it's dual citizenship or just have that religious connection with the state of Israel and support them, who are in Africa exploiting Africa for its resources. From the diamond companies on to cobalt and so forth, they have their hands in that, along with some other people. But I think it's important though we acknowledge that. But yeah.
And I think it's consistent that Israel also votes with the United States every single time. So, for example, with Cuba, there's been a lot of push to end the blockade, which is an illegal blockade of Cuba. Guess who were the two countries in the entire United Nations that voted no? The United States and Israel. So.
Mute. Yeah, Frank, you wanted to add anything before we transition?
Yeah. Let me just use 1 minute. I mean, the colonizer always, have their way of making African people to change. Let's say always have their way to change the narrative or the perspective that we African, we always look at them, as the savior and all of those things. Like they will go and commit the atrocity, they'll go and commit all the worst crime in the world, but they will come back again, right, and try to change the narrative, make it look that they are the best, they have done nothing wrong. But the issue here is, I think we African, we have accepted them for so long, and we have to come to realize that that's not how it is. It's wrong. So what is going on right now is also about trying to change the narrative of Asia, to make Asia look like they are the best, they are good, they are God-fearing nation or country, and what are those things? But they are not. So it is unto us, and I love the stand as Black people, as African people, and taking a stand and say, no, we don't want to be part of part of you because you are this. We need to point them out. The more we point these people out, the best it will become good for us, and the best also it will enlighten people to mobilize to get to know the truth. Because whenever they come out of these things and we allow it to go on, that just shows that our history are being wiped away, wanting to be learned, are being wiped away. But I love this thing. I think I was also reading something. I think the Palestinian, Miss Palestina, also, I think she tapped out, from going to South Africa. I mean, from going to Asia, from partaking in the whole issue as well. I was reading something like that.
Yeah, I'm just reading the article. It says local beauty pageant organizers have been adamant that recently crowned Miss South Africa should go to the event. They said it's not a politically inspired event. So that's their sentiment.
Everything is politics,
yes.
people.
Oh man, everything. I don't know, but yeah. So we, make sure that we, continue to observe what's happening in South Africa with that, and of course other things as well. I want to move shift the story to West Africa, to Guinea right now, and Guinea had experienced a coup d'etat on September the 5th, which is interesting too, because I don't know if mainstream news outlets have been picking up the story and talking about what's going on in Guinea. It's relatively stable though. The coup d'etat didn't deteriorate into some sort of civil war or anything like that. So maybe that has something to do with it. So, right now the president is Mamadi Doumbouya. And I watched the interview and he spoke about the transition. First of all, the coup d'etat took place because Alpha Conde, who was the prime minister, was ousted after trying to push through new constitutional amendments where he could serve a third term. And Conde being the first elected president since independence in 1958. So, or the only elected president, I think, democratically elected president since 1958. So, that was a big thing. But after serving his two terms, he tried to push through constitutional amendments where he can serve a third term. So that's when there was a backlash and the coup had transpired. Now, Mamadou, I was listening to Mamadi speak, and he was talking about how, they're deeply Pan-African. And I was like, okay, that's cool, because ECOWAS has put sanctions against the government after the coup d'etat. And he didn't, he wasn't trying to separate himself from ECOWAS. He understood why they did what they did, but he said, hey, we're deeply Pan-African, and this is what we want to do. This is what the people want. And, I'm sure Conde has his supporters as well. But, they're going through this transition from what Mamadi is talking about. There's going to be elections in a couple of months. And the people who are him being the president and the prime minister, those people who are in charge of the transitional government are not going to run for elections. This is what was said. So, we can observe and see what happens. But, this is interesting. The people, they are adamant about handling Guinea problems internally and not having any influence from the West or anyone else. So, I like what I'm seeing. Of course, like, nobody wants to see a coup d'etat, but, I want to observe because there's still more that I need to know about the story.
I have a question. Did they change? I forgot to look. Did they change the Constitution? I thought that was something that was being spoken about. Do you know?
Oh, they're going to create a new constitution, which the people, according to Mamadi's, like, we don't want to copy and paste constitutions from around the world. He said, we want, something that's going to connect with the people and relate to the problems that is on the ground in Guinea. So, yeah. What I'm hearing, I'm hearing a lot of great things, and I just want to, continue to observe and see what happens.
Yeah, for me, like, I haven't gotten any red flags about him, and I know other people have. So, for example, some people have posted pictures about Mamadou that, like, he has been trained by the United States, and he like some type of relationship with the French military and stuff like that. But I also recognize that a lot of the people who go through the military in Africa get trained by the Western powers. So that's not an automatic, like, oh, he must be an agent to me. And then it's also important to understand, we have a lot of people in our freedom fight who actually started out being in the military, and then actually, seeing something about the military. I think that's interesting. A lot of people get woke in the military because when you're in the military and you're seeing, oh crap, I'm actually working to hurt my people, and you see, like, just how barbaric the system is for your own eyes. That's honestly one of the things that I think turns a lot of people to being revolutionaries. You should remember, obviously, like Bobby Seale was in the military. Thomas Sankara was in the military. A lot of people, that's kind of where they became politicized. So, I didn't see any red flags about him, and just some of the moves he has made, the fact that he wanted to throw out the Constitution. that's a very important thing, I think, for us to measure what people are trying to do, because these constitutions, like you said, are copy and paste. And copy and paste from the people who control you. Why are they giving you their constitutions? Because they've perfected their constitutions. If you think about how controlled Africans in America are, it's literally it's literally perfected. Think about how controlled Africans are in other countries that are Western countries. So they perfected their constitutions and they give it to Africa and say, this is the standard for democracy. Now, not even saying democracy should be on our mind. To me, the biggest thing on our mind should be liberation and representation of all Africans. And I don't think democracy is that by default. But if this is him saying that we're going to try to find a way that Guineans will actually be able to push for something representative of them, like I that's a good thing. So while I don't want to, necessarily say, oh, this person is, perfect, or this person's right for us, there's good moves, like you kind of pointed out, that makes me feel like, okay, maybe this could possibly be leading to a positive situation. Especially, I love that you talked about the fact that they were trying to get Alpha Conde out of power. Like there was mass demonstrations, all people out in the streets trying to get this man out of power, and the ECOWAS protected him. And now that the people actually got what they want, he's out of power, the ECOWAS are sanctioning them. That lets you know what the ECOWAS are about.
Yeah, indeed. And you raised a good point too about just being trained in the West. And so, that's something just I think to observe, to make sure that, because he's speaking from what I'm hearing, he's about the people. He wants the people to sort of dictate the transformation of Guinea. So, with that being said, as long as there's not this like top down, coming from the West with these ideas, like I know what's best for the people, and I don't get that sentiment from him. So, so far, so good. No, Frank, if you wanted to add anything before we. You're on mute, Frank.
Yeah, I mean, I was just trying to say that, I really like his stand as a military man, and you can really see it. Because if not, I can tell you, the West if not because of him, I can tell you, then by now the West have penetrated, that whole issue about Guinea, and by now they have put in their own military or their own president and thing. Because you can see even how they call it, AU is being silent on the whole issue as an African entity, as an African organization that need to be on the forefront. You don't even hear AU into these things, because that's why you know that AU have been bought by the West. Even ECOWAS, most of the conflict I see going on in Africa, that you don't see ECOWAS, really on the forefront. They always sit back and rely. They did the same thing about Liberia, where the United States went and bought them, and bought them not to do anything about Liberia, and they all sat down and waited until people died. But I love the stand of this guy, as being a military man, and he's saying nobody coming. Even some African leaders have even gone to him, trying to make him look that the boogeyman man or the bad man, especially the Ghanaian president, who I got respect for in some other way. But he put the Ghanaian president into perspective, like, look, listen, this is Guinean problem. We're going to handle it the Guinean way. If you guys can come to us as African, we'll handle it the Guinean way. And I love that stand.
Hey, right on. So that's our news. We're going to make our transition into our book with Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. So you can go right to chapter 4. I saw Baruti. He had put a message, talked about the Arab slave trade. I don't know if you was reading ahead or not, Baruti, but Walter Rodney mentions the Arab slave trade in this chapter. But we're going to get started so we can get into this discussion. So chapter 4. All right, chapter 4 is Europe and the Roots of African Underdevelopment to 1885. All right, so starting off with the quote, the relation between the degree of destitution of peoples of Africa and the length of nature of the exploitation they had to endure is evident. Africa remains marked by the crimes of the slave traders. Up to now, her potentialities are restricted by underpopulation. Ahmed Sékou Touré, Republic of Guinea, 1962. All right. So the European slave trade as a basic factor in Africa, in African underdevelopment. To discuss trade, Africans and Europeans in the 4 centuries before colonial rule is virtually to discuss slave trade. Strictly speaking, the African only became a slave when he reached a society where he worked as a slave. Before that, he was first a free man and then a captive. Nevertheless, it is acceptable to speak of the trade in slaves when referring to the shipment of captives from Africa to various other parts of the world where they were to live and work as the property of Europeans. The title of this section is deliberately chosen to call attention to the fact that the shipments were all by Europeans to markets controlled by Europeans, and this was in the interest of European capitalism and nothing else. In East Africa and the Sudan, many Africans were taken by Arabs and were sold to Arab buyers. This is known in European books as the Arab slave trade. Therefore, let it be clear that when Europeans shipped Africans to European buyers, it was the European slave trade from Africa. Undoubtedly, with few exceptions such as Hawkins, European buyers purchased African captives on the coast of Africa, and the transaction between themselves and Africans was a form of trade. It is also true that very often the captain was sold and resold as he made his way from the interior to the port of embarkation. Looking at the word embarkation, I think it's supposed to be tation, but that too was a form of trade. However, on the whole, the process by which captives were obtained on African soil was not trade at all. It was through warfare, trickery, banditry, and kidnapping. When one tries to measure the effect of European slave trading on the African continent, it is essential to realize that one is measuring the effect of social violence rather than trade in any normal sense of the word. We want to build on that. I think Baruti, he brought up in the chat the Arab slave trade. So, I thought that was like right on time. Rodney, he doesn't go into the detail of the history of the Arab slave trade. He just sort of brings it up. But I think it is an important part of African history because we do talk about the last 600 years we've experienced with European contact, 500 to 600 years, with the, beginning with the Portuguese taking of Africans into the Canary Islands and into Europe in the 1400s. But, for centuries, the Arabs were trading African people into North Africa, all the way to the East Africa, all the way into the Middle East. And that's an important trade where you have millions of Africans who were being taken from the other coast of Africa into the East. So we're talking about a 1,000-year period, really, if we really want to talk about this slave trade that existed. And that's why, I think it is important to acknowledge the settler colonists in North Africa as well as East Africa. Now, if they plan to fight on the side of African people to overthrow colonialism, and then they can buy their way into Africa that way. But I think they do have to be acknowledged, though, because I'm in discussions where people, talk about the Arabs, their role in the African Revolution. So, yeah, I don't know if y'all had some thoughts on that.
And whenever Frank talks, maybe I'll grab the book. There's a good book written by Kahindi Andrews where he really breaks down colonialism. And he goes into detail probably more than what I've seen before about how the Arab slave trade, it was very significant. It was not the big transatlantic slave trade, but it was very significant, especially because it literally led directly to the transatlantic slave trade. The Europeans many times were mimicking the things that they learned from the Arab slave trade. So it is a part of our history that I think we do have to discuss, but it does become overshadowed because, let's be real, the transatlantic slave trade was far more extensive. It affected all of Africa. It took so much of the African population in Africa, just that event. Some people think Africa is just suffering just because of colonialism. Colonialism obviously is huge, but the extraction of millions of your people. Think about it. Like, think about your community. Think about if, you know, every other house where someone lives, that house was empty, and how is that community going to function? That's literally how Africans had to grapple with. A lot of civilizations inside of Africa lost a great mass of their populations, and that was very devastating to obviously the people who were taken, but also to the African continent. So I do think, you know, I agree, Birdie, like, you know, we have to talk more about the Arab slave trade, but not to confuse ourselves that, one, there's things that there's traumas that we're experiencing in the Arab slave trade that have to be addressed. And I'm not as familiar with them because I'm not someone who, I'm not an African that's more ingrained with that part of Africa, like North and East Africa. But there are traumas that they can speak to that need to be addressed. And also, we also have to keep in mind that the European came in after the fact, with guns blazing, with the more effective and perfected colonialism and slave trade. And so we have to give due weight to each parts of our history.
Yeah, and you know, and the point I want to make too about you know, this settler colonialism, we're talking about the Arabs, because there was the slave trade, and there was the colonization too of Africa as well, that Africans are still impacted by to this day. And even, you know, when we look, and I think we don't have these discussions enough too, as far as the continued exploitation that's taking place in Africa by the ruling class in these Middle Eastern countries, and even India is getting into it as well as China. But, you know, just particularly speaking about the Arab countries, and if we look at Dubai is the headquarters of many of the African companies and corporations. Like, they are moving their central location to Dubai. And so I think that's symbolic of just the exploitation that's taking place of Africa lands and people by these same people who were trading Africans prior to Europe. And I think you made a great point too, because Portugal looked at the plantations in the Middle East, the sugar plantations, and used that as an example, you know, of what they could do when they set up the sugar plantations in the Canary Islands, which will then later come to the Americas, right? But yeah, I think, like, just continue to make that connection and staying on top of that, because when, you know, I think if we do focus just on the Europeans, because it is more recent and it does impact us in the Americas more than it does, so we're going to speak about that more, right? But understanding that, you know, we were assaulted on both sides of the country. And the last point too is continent. But last point too is yeah, you know, we got to look at the trade of Africans that's still taking place right now, the human trafficking that's taking place, Sierra Leonean women, you know, in Lebanon, that's being exploited in other places too. But yeah, just wanted to raise that.
And just to respectfully disagree with my brother Barutzi, yes, let's not get confused. The Arab slave trade was not less evil. That's not what I'm saying. What I mean by more encompassing, the transatlantic slave trade affected, first of all, it led directly to the colonization by the Europeans and led to the creation of new countries where there were plantation economies. So when you're talking about Haiti, when you're talking about Jamaica, when you're talking about St. Lucia, when you're talking about Guyana, like a mass exportation to another civilization that in these countries still exist, are still living under the same colonial rule. So when I say more extensive, it touched more of Africa, it touched more of the world. So that, I mean, that's the way I look at it. And this is respectful, just disagreements. You know, I think that we give the Arab slave trade due weight when we analyze the history, when we analyze how it led to, and that's a big thing, it led directly to the European slave trade. But let's not get confused to think that the Arabs' control over Africa is as encompassing as Western control. Is there control like the places Dubai where people go and people sell us out? Absolutely. Let's address all of those. But let's keep in mind, like, there's something very vicious happening at the United Nations that is controlled by 5 countries. 3 of which are Western European countries, 4 of which are European countries, 1 is an Asian country. Those people are the ones that are controlling the world today. And so that's what I mean by giving things due weight and understanding that it's complex. It's, to me, it's not either or. We can have room to talk about both, but we also have to give due weight to the ruling powers of today that affect all Africans. That's what I would say.
You want to add anything, Frank, before we move?
Yeah. Let me just use 1 minute. Yeah. I mean, Tiani, you guys said, everything correctly and stuff. Let me just, add about the transatlantic slave trade as well. I think the Arab slave trade, actually, it's not like we are trying to put them in a position where we will say, okay, their method was accepted. When it comes to slavery, no method, is being accepted. They were all bad. That's the bottom line of it. No method was accepted. But the issue here is that the Arab slave trade gave way to the transatlantic slave trade. So with the Arab slave trade, what the transatlantic slave trade did extensively, the Arab slave trade did not do that. So what did the transatlantic slave trade do? And that is why most of the time when people talking about slavery, they focus on the transatlantic slave trade. Because with the transatlantic slave trade came about colonization, came about exploitation, which of course the Arab slave, the Arab too, is also a form of exploitation, as Tiana said that productivity will have been taken from Africa, because if you take away manpower of a town or village, you are also taking away productivity as well. But with the transatlantic slave trade, it came with colonization, it came with exploitation, it came with control, it came with torture, it came with killing, it came with dehumanizing African people and all of those things. So it was brutal. And that is why most of the time people actually focus on it. But it's not like we focus on it and then we're trying to leave out the Arab slave trade. The Arab slave trade was not as brutal as the transatlantic slave trade. But the point is that both of them were not necessary and both of them were against humanity.
All right. We're gonna move on. I ain't even gonna measure. I'm with you. Like, they both was brutal, but but the point being is we're still impacted by both of those trades that took place. And today, when we're fighting against all settler colonialists and colonists. So just to move on, I'm at the final paragraph, and am I there? Yeah. So the final paragraph, many things remain uncertain about the slave trade and its consequences for Africa, but the general picture of destructiveness is clear, and that destructiveness can be shown to be the logical consequence of the manner of recruitment of captives in Africa. One of the uncertainties concerns the basic question of how many Africans were imported. This has long been an object of speculation, with estimates ranging from a few million to over 100 million. A recent study has suggested a figure of about 10 million Africans landed alive in the Americas, the Atlantic islands, in Europe. Because it is a low figure, it is already being used by European scholars who are apologists for the capitalist system and its long record of brutality in Europe and abroad. In order to whitewash the European slave trade, then they find it convenient to start by minimizing the numbers concerned. The truth is that any figure of Africans imported into the Americas, which is narrowly based on the surviving records, is bound to be low, because there were so many people at the time who had a vested interest in smuggling slaves and withholding data. Nevertheless, if the low figure of 10 million was accepted as the basis for evaluating the impact of slaving on Africa as a whole, the conclusion that could legitimately be drawn would confound those who attempt to make light of the experience of the rape of Africans from 1445 to 1870. On any basic figure of Africans landed alive in the Americas, one would have to make several extensions, starting with a calculation to cover mortality and transshipment. The Atlantic Crossing, or Middle Passage, as it was called by European slavers, was notorious for the number of deaths incurred averaging in the vicinity of 15 to 20%. There were also numerous deaths in Africa between time of capture and time of embarkation, especially in cases where captives had to travel hundreds of miles to the coast. Most important of all, given the warfare was the principal means of obtaining captives, it is necessary to make some estimate as to the number of people killed and injured so as to extract the millions who were taken alive and sound. The resultant figure would be many times the millions landed alive outside of Africa. And it is that figure which represents the number of Africans directly removed from the population and labor force of Africa because of the establishment of slave production by Europeans. The massive loss to the African labor force was made more critical because it was composed of able-bodied young men and young women. Slave buyers preferred their victims between the ages of 15 and 35, and preferably in the early 20s, the sex ratio being about 2 men to 1 woman. Europeans often accepted younger African children, but rarely any older person. They shipped the most healthy wherever possible, taking the trouble to get those who had already survived an attack of smallpox and who were therefore immune from further attacks of that disease, which was then one of the world's great killer diseases. We could build on that, like I'm thinking, one of the things I was just thinking in this, the fitting title of Underdevelopment, this trade that's taking place between Europeans and Africans, of African people, and the damage that is doing to the overall African economy, is, as well as like culture, livelihood and everything. But that, Europeans, through this trade are basically benefiting the most economically. Africans are not benefiting from this trade. Well, at least, there's a small minority who may be benefiting. But when you trace the money, even to this day, like who benefited from Africa? And that's why even when from the trade, but that's why I even get into these conversations about Africans who participated in the trade of Africans. Like that's not even the larger point. We do have to acknowledge the complicity of African people. But the point is, who are we dealing with today? Who is the colonial powers of the day that we're fighting against? We're not fighting against a trade that took place 500 years ago, even though we talk about that history. We're fighting against colonialism today. And those people are the Europeans who were able to benefit from this 500-year relationship. And so, we're not trying to liberate ourselves from Nigeria. We're not trying to liberate ourselves from Ghana. We're not trying to liberate ourselves from Guinea. We're trying to liberate ourselves from white imperialism. But I think, I like how he's getting into the numbers as well, and just showing how the impact of our most ablest Africans are being taken out of Africa, and how that's going to affect. I think it's leading up to how it impacts and affects Africa later on. A large population of people. And last point too, I think there's a number where there's I think 4 out of 10 Africans who were taken to the coast, or it may have even been larger. 6 out of 10, I might have it backwards, that did not survive to the coast to be traded. So if you even calculate those numbers, man, we're talking about millions of Africans who lost their lives over this period.
Yeah, probably one of the, and I love that he talks about the fact that we really don't, we will never know. That's going to be one of the great mysteries. Only God can tell you. Like, no one knows just how negatively affected we have been by the transatlantic slave trade or by colonialism. Because as they said, the people, the victors are the ones who tell history. The victors, the ones who conquered, the ones who won, the ones who are today still in power, they get to tell the history. So we don't know how many people died. They didn't keep accurate records, as he was saying, about how many people were taken. I think where he's going with this, though, is that this low number is nowhere compared to the amount of Africans who were taken from the African continent. So it's a real tragedy, I think. And I think, again, I like the point you made. The whole point of us looking back, yes, we want to know our history. Yes, you can't know where you're going unless you know where you came from. But I think even further, as far as African people, because we're still colonized. I don't know if you all get that by we trust colonialism. We try to get us to remember that this is not a past system. This is a present system. And because we're still colonized, because we're still under colonial rule, we have to figure out that these people who are still controlling us, how did they get the leverage? How did they get the power? How did they get us to comply with the system? And only by figuring out, first of all, who our main enemies are, who are the people who conspired against us, will we be able to unseat them. And I think that kind of goes to, like, you know, whether it's debate on the Arab slave trade versus the transatlantic, or whether it's a debate that people have on the role of Africans in the continent who did collaborate with Europeans as far as the transatlantic slave trade. As you said, you know, to me, public enemy number one is always the person who's killing you presently. None of our African brothers and sisters who participated in the slave trade are still, first of all, none of them are alive. Second of all, if you all didn't know, you probably have blood of someone who also collaborated, because a lot of those people who participated in selling our brothers and sisters were also captured at some point.
Not me. Don't put me in not my bloodline.
But, I mean, even if that's not the case, let's not forget on the plantations, there were, you know, you don't like the term Uncle Tom, but there were the house Negroes, you know, who worked with the master. So, you know, there's always going to be like that relation that we really can't figure out these people from the past. But what we can figure out for today is what institutions were created back then that are still controlling the futures of Africa. And the big powers today are the United Nations, NATO, Council of Foreign Relations, you know, WCC. We're working, if y'all didn't know, we're working with a number of other Pan-Africanist organizations. We've built a coalition with them called Africa Unity Movement for Decolonization. And the purpose of this is we're going to get really specific. Who are all of these people who are collaborating against us? Because until we are aware of who it is that's did it today, then we'll kind of be just grappling with history. But I think when we understand who is the ones in power today, we can effectively go back and figure out where did it start and how do we truly decolonize, not the surface level decolonization that I hear some people say, like the word decolonize is being thrown around a lot. I'm sure you all know.
I'm sitting here thinking, I'm like, we need to have a debate, but not a debate just to prove who's right, but a debate on the Arab versus the European slave trade, just for the sake of the information, because I think a lot can come out in a healthy debate. But again, it's not like to prove who's right. I think it's more so just to get the information out. Frank, you wanted to add any?
Yeah, we actually, running out of time and thing, but like Tiani said, so I'm just going to add, giving solution. I'm not going to repeat what she said again, but we are saying all of these things, to come to a point, to a point that all of these things are being said, all of these things are being brought out so that we can actually know the truth. And what we need to do after knowing the truth is, to unite, because once we get to know the truth and we know the only weapon to our solution to defeat the imperialists or the colonizer is our unity, is our togetherness. That's the only thing we are lacking of right now, is to organize, and come together and group ourselves and move together, and things. So I think that is what we need to do as we bring out these discussions and things, because the reality here is you may feel that the colonizers are more united and that is why they are strong. No, what unites them is because their forefathers used us, and they got rich out of us, and they are maintaining that status quo. Because when you look at the World Bank, their forefathers created that World Bank, and they used us right through the plantation and through the selling of black folks and all of those things, and they become rich today, and they don't want to control the World Bank and thing. But the reality here is they are not really united. They are only united if they are coming against African people. That's the time they will be united. Other than that, during the colonial period in Africa, for example, Germany, was controlling Cameroon, right? But the French and the English got together, right? And they went against Germany. But these are the same people in the 1884 Berlin Conference. These are the same people who were sitting in that meeting when they divided Africa. And then how can then they went against one another? Because two that had the same interest, and one of them now had the same interest, and it went against one of them. So the French and the English went against the German and defeated the German, and that's why today in Cameroon you have one part French, one part how do you call it, English. I'm just giving a scenario to say that these people are not really united. We may think that they are united, but they are not united, because the only reason here is they had the financial capability and they control our land and our resources. That's all.
Hey, the chat is on fire. Hey, I want to appreciate everybody for tuning in to another hour of our podcast and book club. Make sure y'all are with us next week. We're here next week. I know it's
I could be here. Well, I'll talk to y'all.
All right. So, but we'll let you know if we're going to be here next week. Just tune in to We Charge Colonialism every Saturday at 10 a.m. But make sure that you're liking and sharing so we can get more and more people to be a part of these discussions. And until, next time, was to say peace.